Townsend Estate, Virginia, August 12, 1856.
The first scream came from the wet nurse. Sharp, guttural, like something had just torn loose from her soul. Porcelain shattered next, a teacup hitting the floor near the nursery doorway. Then the door slammed open so hard it cracked against the wall. Footsteps thundered up the grand staircase, and there, at the top, Eleanor Townsend stood, barefoot, trembling, her white nightgown clinging to her like a second skin, soaked through with sweat and blood. In her arms, 2 newborns, still slick with afterbirth, still crying. But that's not what shocked the household. It was her stomach, flat, her face, pale, and the undeniable truth everyone had whispered for months now. Finally, visible, because Eleanor Townsend hadn't been pregnant. Not yesterday, not last month, not ever. So whose children were they? Downstairs, the help huddled in dark corners. You could hear whispered prayers between gasps, some in English, others in Gula. No one dared speak above a whisper, because they all knew what they'd seen earlier that night, just before moonrise. A man had slipped out of the nursery window, barefoot, shirtless, dark-skinned. A slave named Josiah. His face hadn't held fear, just urgency and heartbreak. Eleanor hadn't cried, not once. Even now, holding those infants, her lips didn't move. But her eyes, God help her, her eyes screamed. Imagine standing there, watching this unfold, knowing what would come next, the punishment, the rage, the scandal that would tear through every brick of this house. In the east wing, a bedroom door creaked open. The master's room, empty, his boots still by the hearth, his pistol, gone. Where was Jonathan Townsend? Why hadn't he come when the nurse screamed? Why was the mistress alone? And why had the fire in the nursery burned low, like someone had doused it in silence? Down below, the estate dogs began to howl. Inside, the cries of the twins rose again. But this time, Eleanor moved. Slowly, deliberately, she backed down the staircase, the shadows clinging to her like mourning veils. Her steps were soft, but the weight behind them shook the house. Behind her trailed droplets of blood, not hers, not theirs, someone else's. You can almost hear it, the ragged breath of a house holding in its panic, the tension stretching like thread, ready to snap. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the clock had stopped ticking. And just before, the first light of dawn would stain the fields pink, the Townsend estate was already changed. Forever. Before the sun rose, one man would be dragged to the whipping post, and another would vanish into the Georgia swamps, carrying more than just guilt. He carried truth and twins who bore his eyes. To the outside world, the Townsend estate was a picture of southern wealth. Magnolia trees lining the drive, whitewashed columns glowing in the evening sun, and the sound of distant violins leaking from the open parlor windows. Inside, crystal, chandeliers hummed with candlelight. Velvet curtains framed every tall window. The floor beneath Eleanor's feet was imported marble from Italy, cool even in the August heat. Every chair was hand-carved, every plate polished silver. The guests wore silk. The wine was French. The roses, freshly clipped from the garden by the housegirls that morning. But just beyond the columns, past the sycamores and the white picket fences, was the other side of the estate. The slave quarters, shack rows, mud floors, roofs patched with palm fronds and old rags. There, the smell wasn't roses and roast duck, but sweat, piss, and scorched cotton. No chandeliers, no violins, only silence. And chains. Imagine standing in both worlds, velvet beneath your fingers, but iron at your wrists. By day, the slaves were shadows, always present but never seen. Josiah, the coachman, was one of them. Young, strong, always quiet, always obedient, until you saw the way Eleanor watched him through the lace curtains. He had built the new stable. He polished the family's carriages. And once, when Eleanor had collapsed in the garden from heat stroke, it was Josiah who had carried her. Not a housemaid, not a doctor, but him. That was the first time. The other help had whispered of long looks and soft words exchanged at dusk, of gloves accidentally left on benches, of candles burning in Eleanor's study long after the house had gone to bed, of the way Josiah's shirt started smelling like lavender, the kind only found in the mistress's drawers. No one dared speak it aloud, but everyone knew. "A mistress," they whispered. "Don't look at a slave like that unless she's already made her choice." The overseer, Mr. Callahan, had noticed. He'd tried to warn Jonathan Townsend once, only once. After that, he'd been reassigned to the tobacco fields and never stepped foot inside the house again. Some say Jonathan knew, that he had known for months. But pride is a dangerous poison. It eats away slowly until all that's left is rot disguised as civility. And Eleanor. She walked the halls like a ghost in silk. Her beauty still pristine, her hands still soft. But her eyes, haunted. You can almost feel it, that unbearable contrast. One world draped in velvet and pearls, the other wrapped in calloused hands and cotton-stained rags. In the quarters, the women warned Josiah. Don't look at her. Don't answer when she calls. She's not yours. She never can be. But Josiah had already crossed that line. So had she. And now, 2 new lives had entered the world, but not from love, from defiance, from danger, from something the South had no name for. Something far more threatening than rebellion. Desire, not of ownership, not of power, but of choice. And the South was never built to survive a choice like that. A storm was coming. Not the kind that cracks the sky, but the kind that tears a legacy apart from the inside. And before it passed, it would leave blood on the floor, chains broken in the mud, and a name that no Southern family would ever speak again. Townsend. Before the whispers, before the screams. There was only silence between them. Eleanor was never meant to marry Jonathan Townsend. She was born a Langley, a family with old money and a colder heart. Her marriage to the Townsends was arranged like most others, for land, legacy, and heirs. But Jonathan was never gentle. Not with his words, not with his hands, and certainly not with his wife. Imagine being told your only purpose was to bear a son, and when you didn't, you were punished. Not in public, but behind closed doors, with silence and shame. Josiah had arrived at the estate in 1852. He wasn't born at Riverbend. He came from a sugar plantation in Louisiana, traded like a horse for 2 barrels of molasses and a pocket watch. Tall, quiet, observant. He spoke little, and when he did, it was carefully, almost as if he measured every word for weight. One morning, Eleanor saw him binding a splintered wheel on the carriage, shirt clinging to his back from the heat. She asked his name. He hesitated. Josiah, ma'am. That was the first time he called her ma'am. It would not be the last. Over the months that followed, Eleanor noticed things. How Josiah flinched when overseers raised their voices. How he read by lantern light when he thought no one was watching. How he winced when children cried. She asked him, one day, why he never smiled. He looked away. Because there's nothing funny about being owned. Those words stayed with her. They were the first words that felt like truth. Everything else in her life, the dances, the letters, the garden parties, suddenly felt like stage props in someone else's theatre. She began to write. Letters, notes, half-truths folded into linen napkins and slipped beneath carriage seats. Messages that meant nothing to most, but everything to him. A year later, under the moonlight in the orchard, she asked him what freedom smelled like. He didn't answer with words. He touched her hand, just once. And it was more honest than anything Jonathan Townsend had given her in 5 years of marriage. Now imagine what it meant for a woman of the South, a mistress, to fall in love not with another man of status, but with the very man society told her was less than human. Eleanor swore she'd buy his freedom. She made a promise that once the estate turned a profit in spring, she'd sell her dowry jewels discreetly. Josiah would be sent north to Maryland to safety. They would meet again. He waited, but the spring came, and the jewels were never sold. Why? Because Jonathan found one of the letters, a crumpled scrap, hidden in a carriage wheel well, the ink barely dry, the handwriting unmistakable. He never confronted her, not with words, but the punishments changed. Josiah was reassigned to the field. Eleanor was put to bed for weeks. Her maids said she barely ate. Others said she cried until her voice broke. And yet, 1 month later, she was pregnant, without warning, without joy, without explanation. Was it Jonathan's child or Josiah's? That question alone carried the weight of a loaded pistol. By her 6th month, the staff began to whisper again. They said her belly grew too fast, that she walked with pain in her steps but fire in her eyes. And Josiah, he didn't look at her anymore. He couldn't. Because to look at her now was to remember the promise she'd made and broken, but promises don't stay buried. And as the baby stirred in her womb, another storm brewed beneath the floorboards. The kind that doesn't knock on doors, it kicks them down. By the 3rd trimester, the walls themselves seemed to lean in, listening. Eleanor's skin was pale, stretched, exhausted. Her back ached constantly. Her fingers trembled, yet she refused to be confined to her room. She walked the halls late, into the night, past Josiah's quarters, past the parlor where Jonathan now drank alone, and always, always. Someone was watching. Imagine waking each morning to the feeling that someone had entered your room while you slept, but left no trace except a faint smell of tobacco and fear. The wet nurse whispered to the cook. The cook whispered to the maid. The maid whispered to the overseer. And Jonathan, he didn't speak much anymore, but he had begun to write. Letters, notes, orders. 3 new men were hired that month. Temporary hands, he called them. All carried knives strapped beneath their coats. None of them made eye contact with Josiah. At dinner, Eleanor sat in silence, eyes sunken, hands shaking. Josiah no longer served in the house, but she could feel his absence like a bruise. What would you do if the man you once trusted with your heart was now being hunted under your own roof? And you couldn't stop it. One night, lightning struck the sycamore tree behind the estate. The crack split the night, and with it, the quiet began to unravel. Eleanor's contractions started early, too early. Blood soaked the bed sheets. The midwife screamed for hot water, clean cloth, prayer. But Jonathan refused to call the doctor. "It's too late," he said coldly. "Let God sort this." Josiah stood outside in the rain, bare-chested, fists clenched, unable to enter. But he heard it all. He heard Eleanor cry out his name. He heard the silence that followed. And when the door finally opened, twins, 2 babies, one pale, one not. There are things even Southern charm can't explain away. 2 children, born of one mistress, but carrying 2 very different legacies in their skin. Rumors were no longer whispers, they were wildfire. The plantation split in 2, those who pretended not to see, and those who waited, watched, planned. Eleanor refused to hide the children. She named them herself, dressed them equally, loved them equally. But the house staff, they noticed. They saw Jonathan sitting in the study for hours, his revolver beside a glass of bourbon. They saw the overseers sharpening their blades more often than their plows. They heard Josiah humming lullabies at night, the same lullabies his mother once sang to him, far away before the chains, and they knew something was going to break. Someone was going to bleed. Because when love crosses a line drawn in blood, punishment doesn't knock. It drags. And what happened next would shake the very pillars of the Townsend legacy. It happened at dusk. The kind of dusk where the sky bleeds purple and gold, but the ground smells like smoke and endings. Jonathan Townsend had not spoken to Eleanor in 3 days. Not since the night she defied him, refused to hand over the twins to be raised properly, as he put it. Instead, she cradled them in the nursery. She sang to them. She let Josiah inside. That night, the staff were ordered into their quarters early. The lanterns in the house were dimmed, the front gates locked, and on the back porch stood Mr. Callahan. He hadn't been seen in months, banished to the tobacco field after raising suspicion. But tonight, he returned, with 2 men, rope in one hand, iron shackles in the other. Josiah had just left the nursery. He never made it back to the quarters. They took him from behind, cracking a rifle, butt against his head. No trial, no words, just orders. The kind whispered by men who have already made peace with their cruelty. Imagine hearing your name screamed from the nursery window, only to find yourself face down in the dirt, and realizing it would be the last voice you'd ever hear in love. Eleanor fought. She rushed from the stairs barefoot, her gown dragging behind her like a veil of panic. "Let him go," she screamed. "He's done nothing." Jonathan stood in the doorway, silent, whiskey in hand, watching. "I warned you," he said, his voice low, trembling not with rage, but shame. "You made this house unclean." The whipping post had been moved to the garden, right beneath Eleanor's window. The twins cried. Josiah didn't, even as the first lash struck flesh. 10 lashes, then 20, then 30. The rope cut skin, then muscle. Each strike echoed through the trees like thunder. And Eleanor, she screamed. She clawed at the men, bit one, scratched another, but they pushed her back, forced her into the parlor, locked the doors. You can almost hear it. The sound of a mother screaming through glass as the father of her children is torn apart below her window. And then, silence. Not because the beating stopped, but because Josiah did. He no longer cried. He no longer breathed. They hung him by his wrists, not his neck, left him suspended there, bloodied, unrecognizable, as a warning. But Eleanor, she broke. At midnight, the flames began. The nursery was empty. The house cook, the wet nurse, the stable boy, they were all gone, taken into the swamps by a woman who refused to bury her children in secrets. It wasn't Eleanor who started the fire. It wasn't even the slaves. It was one of the new overseers. Drunk, panicked, trying to burn the past before it could crawl back from the trees. The parlor curtains caught first, then the library, then the roof. The Townsend estate lit the night like a funeral pyre. By morning, nothing stood but smoke. Jonathan was found on the back steps, pistol still in hand, a single bullet through his temple. Mr. Callahan was never found. And Josiah, he was buried in secret, some say by Eleanor, some say by the very men who whipped him. But the rope that held him was found severed, as if someone had cut him down before the fire could finish what hatred began. And the twins, some say they drowned crossing the swamp. Others whisper they lived, raised by the very people their father once called kin, and their mother once called forbidden. But one thing is certain, the name Townsend was never spoken in Burke County again. The land healed, but not evenly. Where once the Townsend estate loomed, with its white columns, wrought iron gates, and manicured hedges, now stood only overgrowth. Ivy crawled across fallen brick. The garden path was choked by weeds, and beneath the soil, ash still whispered. But those who remembered never forgot. The local preacher called it divine punishment. The townspeople called it madness. The slaves, and those who had once been, called it justice. No one rebuilt the house, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. Because when the wind blew from the east, it carried voices, faint cries, whispers of rope and fire. And every New Year's Eve, the night Josiah died, dogs refused to pass the edge of the old property. Chickens stopped laying. Candles wouldn't stay lit. People stopped talking about Eleanor altogether. Some claimed she died in childbirth. Others believed she escaped, fleeing north under a false name, carrying her babies in a basket wrapped with the torn silk of her wedding veil. But those who worked in the fields remembered what she whispered. Just before she vanished, "I will not raise my children in a house built on chains." No birth records of the twins were ever filed. No grave was ever marked for Josiah, but stories have their own kind of immortality. A haunting legacy years. Later, a traveling writer passed through Burke County. He stopped at the rusted gate of the Townsend land, sketching what remained. An old woman, wrinkled like dry cotton, eyes sharp as a switch, warned him not to linger. "That place remembers pain," she said. "And pain don't stay buried just 'cause the house does." She said she once saw a child, pale-skinned, curly-haired, walking that path barefoot, holding a wooden locket, inside 2 braids, one light, one dark, and carved inside the lid, "For JT, born of love, not chains." Imagine it. A world where love itself was illegal, where a mother was punished for bearing life and a father for giving it, where the heart could be owned, but never protected. Eleanor and Josiah's story didn't just shatter the Townsend name. It shattered the illusion of purity that many plantation families clung to. It exposed the quiet hypocrisy that sat at their dinner tables and nursed their children. What happens when the bloodline blurs the lines of power? When the mistress bears the child of the man her husband would have killed? History may erase their names, but it cannot erase the echo, because somewhere, even now, descendants walk this world, not slaves, not masters, just people, born of fire, of scandal, of truth. Stories like this must never be forgotten, not because they are comfortable, but because they are real. If you want to uncover more untold truths and hear the voices history tried to silence, stay with us. We're only just beginning.